Good morning and welcome to Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime is designed to celebrate the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. It's a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, Faculty Development, and other offices on campus. We record most of our programming, and you can find the recordings in the BU Digital Library. Early in October, Leah Fulton, Associate Dean of Intercultural Student Programs and Services, and Ruben Rivera, Chief Diversity Officer, Professor of History, will be leading two presentations entitled Death by 1,000 Paper Cuts, Defining and Exploring Microaggressions, where they will define, discuss microaggressions and their impact, and how to respond appropriately. Today, Scott Kaihai, Reference Librarian, Reference and Instruction Librarian, and our Campus Copyright Liaison, will answer some of your questions about copyright in higher ed, especially with challenges and changes in our current digital climate. Let's give Scott a hand.
All right, thanks, Jay. I'm going to start by just giving a disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer, and nothing I say is legal advice. I'm also not a compliance officer, so the liaison's job is not to make sure everybody's doing things correctly copyright-wise on campus. My job is to connect people with resources and help make sure that as they're making copyright decisions, they have all the resources, they're asking the right questions, they feel comfortable with the copyright decisions that they've relied on. So that's the capacity in which I'll be talking a little bit about. We'll get to fair use eventually, which is what I want to spend the bulk of the time on, since that's one of the more complicated aspects of copyright, but it's also one of the exceptions that we use most often in higher ed. But before I get there, because that can seem a little bit complicated, I want to frame fair use in sort of the context of the other copyright exceptions that are maybe a little bit easier to use, and then sort of that even in the purpose of copyright generally. Because it's good to sort of have a reminder that copyright in the US is not about sort of moral rights. It's not about the inherent right of a creator to have downstream control of things that they create. Copyright in the US is very sort of utilitarian and economics driven. So the law is written so it balances sort of progress of science and culture and being able to build on other people's ideas, which you have on the left there, with the ability to profit off of work that you put in the time and energy to create. And so in higher ed, for instance, if you make a course or you take a course that you've already made and you port it over into an online environment and you do all the work of making the videos and the slides and putting together the gradebook and all that sort of thing, you don't want somebody, say, from another institution to just take what you've done without your permission. You wouldn't even want, unless the development of the course had been negotiated this way, you wouldn't even want your own institution to say, thanks for all that work you put in, we are going to bring in somebody to teach this course for you. You're concerned in that situation with the rights being respected, your copyright as the creator being respected. On the other side of that is more sort of I think the more common question. It's, as you're putting together a course, I want to use X, Y, or Z in my course. Do I have to pay to do it? So in this situation, you're on the other side of that scale. You're thinking, what can I do without paying? What are the exceptions to copyright? What can I do without the author's, maybe even the author's permission, maybe against the author's wishes? And so again, fair use is that's often what people jump to immediately, and that can be a little bit complicated, and that can lead some people to take the Homer Simpson approach to copyright analysis, which is as follows.
I don't see it, it's not illegal.
So if I don't see it, it's not illegal, he says, or sort of the idea of asking for forgiveness rather than permission, either because you think you know what the answer to the question of do I have to pay is going to be and you don't want to hear it, or perhaps it just feels really confusing to try and think about that in the first place. So a couple of things that might simplify the answer to that question to think about are, first, you might want to consider, is it copyrighted in the first place? That's always the first question to ask. So things that are in the public domain, stuff that's been published in the United States before 1923, for instance, those things are not under copyright anymore. So you don't have to ask the question, do I need to pay to use them? Similarly, work produced by the federal government. So that ranges from speeches to reports and data created by federal departments, federal agencies, those sorts of things, because your tax dollars pay for them. The government decided you shouldn't have to pay for them again. Those should be free to use. So if the thing that you're wanting to use isn't in copyright in the first place, say you're doing, you're injecting politics into your course this semester and you want to use presidential speeches and things like that, that would be an example of something that you don't have to even think about licensing or whether or not it's fair use because it's not under copyright in the first place. The next thing to think about, and we'll hopefully have time for questions at the end if there questions occur to you, just keep them in your mind and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. The next thing to think about, often the answer to the question, is it copyrighted in the first place, is yes. And so the next thing to think about is there a specific exception that covers the use that I want to make? And that would be, I'm talking here aside from fair use. That is an exception that we'll talk about, as I've said. But I'm thinking of things like this. So Section 110 for faculty teaching is often one that you probably have leveraged in your class, even if you didn't know that was the mechanism that you were using to be able to make certain uses. That's one that gets used in higher ed all the time. So that's performances and displays when you're in a face-to-face classroom environment is Section 110.1. So doing things like showing a film in class, or if you're in a theater department, doing a play in class, those sorts of things. You don't have to ask for permission to do those, even if things are still in copyright, because that section provides a mechanism by which you can do that without having to pay. Section 110.2 was an attempt by Congress to give some of those same performance and display rights to the online environment. Say you're live casting over the internet instead of doing a face-to-face class. How useful it is sort of up for debate. There's a lot of hoops to jump through for that one, but just the point of sort of highlighting these is to help you to remember to ask the question, is there an exception? Before we even get to fair use or before we get to asking permission or licensing, there are exceptions written into the copyright law that are very easy to sort of tell. Do I have to pay for this or not? And face-to-face performances and displays is one of those things that is fairly easy. So something to keep in mind as you're trying to answer that question. And then finally, before we get to use, the last thing I want to highlight is ask the question, is there a license that covers my use? So I'm thinking here of largely library subscriptions and open access Creative Commons sorts of licenses. So the library, one of our main roles here on campus is to get material for research and for teaching, and our collections, especially our online collections, are growing year by year. So if you haven't checked in a while to see if that VHS tape that you use in your course has been updated, whether there's a digital version of it or there's something comparable that could possibly serve the same purpose in a digital database. Our streaming films databases now, I think there's something like 40,000 videos between them, and that's not YouTube content, that's educational content that we've curated specific for those sorts of in-class uses. And if we have things like that, it's already paid for, it's already licensed. You just need to link to it then or direct your students to it or show it in class. That's not something that you need to think about, do I need to pay for this? Again, it's already paid for. Similarly, our ebook collections are now almost as big as our print book collection. So there's a Bonhoeffer class that's running either this fall or in the spring. And when I was talking to the professor about that, we have now Dietrich Bonhoeffer's full works in ebook format, and as many people can access them at the same time as they want. So that's a case where students don't have to buy those primary source textbooks because the professors can just link to them. They're licensed already. There's a license that covers the use that they want to make and reduce, in the attempt to reduce the textbook cost to students. So library subscriptions is one thing to think about with licensing. The other one is, can you find something that's open access online, whether that's in an open access journal, an institutional repository where people are keeping preprint copies of the journal publications that they submit. Oftentimes publishers now will allow for that, where you can put preprint publications in your institution's own sort of digital archive of faculty scholarship. So that can be a place to look for papers that you're wanting your students to assign, to your students. See if there's a place online like that where they have it and it's covered by an obvious license. Creative Commons licenses. Those, if you haven't heard of them, that's just a way for creators to very easily attach a simple license. The icons here are examples of what those look like if you've ever seen that on any content that you've come across on the web. There are various ways for creators to say, I want people to be able to use my stuff as long as they attribute it to me, or as long as they don't use it for commercial use. You can sort of stipulate the conditions that you want to attach to your work and then put it out there on the web for people to use and build off of. So all of the images, for instance, or most of them in the presentation that I have today, I found in an image repository where one of the requirements of submitting your work there is you have to assign it a Creative Commons public domain license. Meaning I can do whatever I want with those images and I don't have to pay, I don't have to even attribute if I don't want to the authors. So increasingly there's content like that that's sort of pre-licensed for you out on the internet, and looking for that content and making sure you understand the terms of the license is one way that you can answer the question, do I have to pay to put this in Moodle, very easily. You can look for things like that where the terms are pretty well spelled out. But if you go through all of those things, it is under copyright. There's no exception that covers what you want to do. There is no license available for the thing that you want to use, or no exact equivalent with a license. Then the exception that I want to spend the rest of the time on today is fair use. And can you nod your head if you have some familiarity with fair use before you've been using it? Okay, so that's good. I'm assuming some basic familiarity with fair use here, because what I want to do is I'll kind of overview it briefly, but then I want to look at a current case involving higher education and fair use that will give us a great deal of insight into sort of how we can think of fair use with things like copying book chapters and putting them into an e-reserve course, and what that case can tell us about what we need to think about when we want to do things like that. But very briefly, in case you need a refresher, fair use is an exception that has 4 factors involved that you think about to decide whether something is fair use or not. And those 4 factors are the purpose of the use, so what are you doing with the thing that you're using? What is it that you're using, the nature of the work, what kind of thing is it? How much of it are you taking? And then probably most importantly, market harm. So what is the effect of what you're doing on, if you think back to those scales at the beginning, the ability of the creator to profit from the work that they made. How is what you're doing going to affect or not their ability to profit from that? And the case that I want to look at to sort of illustrate this in a current higher ed context is the Georgia State copyright case. Has anybody been keeping up with that? Are you familiar with that? Has anybody heard of that at all? Okay, most people haven't, it looks like. So the Georgia State copyright case, I think it's been going on for 8 years now or so. It was originally filed back in 2008. And it involves, obviously, Georgia State University, whose library has an e-reserve system, like many libraries in higher education do. So instead of having physical books put on reserve that students have to come to the library to check out and read a chapter of, they were scanning book chapters and uploading them to an e-reserve system where students could then log in to their class and read the readings that professors had scanned for them. And from the professor's point of view, it's the same as coming in and doing it in the library. You just don't have to actually make the trip. But from the publisher's perspective, they thought it was more like course packs, which you typically have to pay licensing fees for, because you're making a copy and you're uploading it and distributing it. It's not just having students access the same physical book. So they sued Georgia State over that, specifically Oxford University Press, Sage Publications, and Cambridge University. Those 3 got together and they found 99 examples of where Georgia State had done this, and they brought them all to the judge and said, look at what Georgia State's doing, here's all these examples of how they're scanning and copying our stuff. The Copyright Clearance Center, which you may have used before, and the Association of American Publishers, they helped fund this case. So you can sort of see the people who stand to benefit financially, substantially, if the verdict goes in favor of the publishers, are all sort of in here getting a piece of the action. But they sued Georgia State, and the judge, this has been back and forth a few times. So the lower court came down with a decision, and then that was appealed. And in that first decision, so of the 99 counts that were brought, only 5 were found to be infringing. So that was largely a victory for Georgia State. Most of those instances were found to be fair use. Publishers obviously didn't like that. They appealed. The circuit court said we don't disagree with the initial ruling. We don't disagree with the end result that this is mostly fair use, but we don't really like how the judge got there. They didn't like her reasoning in sort of those 4 factors. And so they gave her instructions, and basically they sent it back down to her. They remanded the case and said, we want you to decide this again, but this time when you consider those 4 factors, this is what you should pay attention to and see if your result is any different or the same. And so that's, that decision on remand just came down 6 months ago, so March 31st. And that's the one, I'm going to sort of look at the back and forth here as we go factor by factor, but that's the one that gives us a whole lot of insight, because not only do we have one district court judge's opinion on this, but we have an appeals court, a circuit court, sort of saying this is what you did well, this is what you didn't do well. So this isn't a Supreme Court decision. Things about this case could still change. The ruling that just came down might not stand exactly as it is if they keep appealing. And I just heard a couple weeks ago that the publishers plan to appeal again. So this is still in flux. However, even if we don't have the final word on how to think about scanning book chapters like this, it's really, really instructive to look at how the courts have been thinking about this, just because there is no other case in fair use history. As I've gone to copyright conferences and heard lawyers speak on this, they all say there is no other case where a university has been sued for doing things like this. So this is the sort of the best case we have to give us some insight into our own situation. So as we think about the first factor then, what does this case tell us about the first factor, the purpose of the use? The quote that I have up here is sort of the introductory section to the fair use, section 107, which is the fair use exception of copyright legislation. This is how it starts out. It says that fair use for things like news reporting, things like teaching, things like criticism and comment, it's not an infringement of copyright. So it goes back again to that scale. Congress wants things like these to be able to happen without the creators restricting them entirely. And so the judge initially in that first decision took that purpose and said, because all of these uses, she didn't even look at the individual cases. She sort of said, in every case, this is for higher education, this is for classroom teaching. Therefore, factor 1 always strongly favors fair use, because it's always a classroom use. It's always in use for higher education. And the circuit court agreed with that. They said, yeah, we agree that it's always fair use. So in every single one of those 99 instances, we can just sort of blanket say, this is always a purpose that favors fair use because it's classroom teaching. However, they did say, the second point there, it's mirror image copying. It's not transformative use. So you can't say it strongly favors fair use, the first factor, because it's not a transformative use. It just favors it. And the concept of transformative use, if that's not something that's familiar to you, when you think about fair use, I'll illustrate it with a different case here and then come back to Georgia State. So the idea behind transformative use is when you're appealing to a different audience or using something in a way that's completely different than it was originally intended to be used. So you have the picture on the left here, which was taken by sort of a marketing advertising photographer named Andrea Blanche. So she took a picture of that and sold it to Gucci, and Gucci used it to advertise their sandals that particular year. And the image on the right is from an artist named Jeff Koons. And he took the feet, you can see, as they're circled there. He flipped them around, he took them out of their context, added color, put some other feet and some donuts and whatever else is in the background there, and created this collage. And I'm admittedly a Philistine when it comes to modern art. So I believe his intention there was to make some commentary on consumerism or capitalism, something of that sort. But in any case, he sold that work for a few $100,000. And Andrea Blanche, the photographer, said, you didn't ask me if you could use my image, and you didn't pay me when you made the sale of yours, and I'm not okay with that. And so she took him to court and said, I should be getting a cut of this. And his defense, his fair use defense, obviously he goes through all 4 of the factors, but the major defense hinged on the idea of transformative use. He said, I took these feet and I applied them to a completely different medium, a completely different audience, a completely different market. Nobody would confuse my piece with yours. Nobody would buy my artwork to advertise Gucci's sandals, and I didn't impede your ability to sell your photograph as a piece of marketing. You are still able to fully profit from your work even as I'm repurposing it for something else. And so I didn't harm your market is basically what it came down to. You never intended to license this thing to artists. This was always a marketing thing. So I transformed what you did. And the court agreed with him on that point. They said, yes, that is a transformative use. It ties sort of those first and fourth factors together. So when your purpose is transformative, the idea is you're appealing to a different market, so you're not harming the market for the original. So if you can demonstrate fair use, it makes your overall fair use case really, really strong. And so going back to the Georgia State case with that, the appeals court said, yes, educational uses, as far as purpose is concerned, factor one, favor fair use, but what Georgia State was doing was not a transformative use. So just because their purpose was educational doesn't automatically mean, as it sometimes does, that they were appealing to a different market. There still is the question of market harm to consider. So that's sort of one of the major points we can draw away as far as factor one is concerned. Factor two, again, the purpose of the nature of the work. So what is it that they were taking? In every case, in the Georgia State case, it was always a scholarly monograph, a scholarly book that they were taking one or more chapters of. And so the judge's initial sort of thinking on this was, facts cannot be copyrighted. So ideas and facts, you can't put a copyright on that. You can copyright the expression of your facts. So if you write an article, outlining a particular concept, your particular words that you chose, those are copyrighted, but the ideas that you're communicating aren't. Other people can use those and build off those. So the judge sort of used that and said, well, because scholarly work is fact-based, and facts can't be copyrighted, these kind of works have sort of thinner copyright protection. So as far as the nature of the work is concerned, they wouldn't have as much protection as something highly creative like a painting or a poem or something like that. Where everything's imagined, there is nothing about it that's not copyrightable. So she said factor two tends to favor fair use in every case because this is all fact-based stuff. This is all scholarly works. But the circuit court, I shouldn't have advanced yet. The circuit court didn't like that. The appeals court said, well, yeah, facts can't be copyrighted, but scholarly work is more than just bare communication of facts oftentimes. There's often, author opinion, subjective analysis, stuff like that that goes into scholarship. And so you need to look, when you do this again, you need to look at the actual content that's being copied from the excerpt that is being used. And so she did that, and this decision this second one was about 225 pages long. I've read it, and the most boring parts of it are her basically book reports on the different books that are being used. So she's going through and saying, this is objective description, this is subjective description. She's characterizing, according to the instructions of the Second Circuit, the excerpts that have been copied. And she often comes to an opinion similar to this. Because there's some mixture of opinion and subjective content with the bare communication of facts, this factor doesn't really weigh one way or the other. It's kind of neutral. So the takeaway from that then is it might not just be enough, if you're used to doing fair use analyses on the assumption that if it's scholarly, it's more nonfiction, fact-based, that tends to weigh in favor of fair use. I've heard that a lot as people do fair use arguments. This case gives us the suggestion that maybe that's not enough. Maybe you actually need to look at the specific excerpt and decide what kind of content is this, how much of it is copyrightable. So that's something to think about with the second factor, although the circuit court also did say factor two carries very little weight in the overall four-factor analysis. Of the different factors that we're considering, factor two, the nature of the work, is probably the least important, is what they said. So you have to consider it because that's what Congress instructed us to do with this particular exception, but you don't have to necessarily give them all the same weight. And factor two, in a scenario like this, is of relatively little importance, is what they said. Which brings us to amount, factor three. This is one of the more important ones they talked about. And often this is the one where people feel like, I hear a lot with fair use, well, as long as I'm under 10%, or as long as I'm only using one chapter, it's fair use, right? Like they want these bright line cutoffs, where as long as I'm under this amount, it automatically makes it fair use. And that's not true, and this case definitely confirms that. And it confirms not only that, but you can't even do that for the individual factor 3. So the judge in the original decision, as she was going count by count through those 99 instances that were brought, in order to sort of simplify things for both her and I think her later reading audience, she came up with this system whereby as long as, so for a work of 10 chapters or more, as long as they were using less than one chapter, she considered that amount small enough that she wasn't substituting for the sale of the original work. So if you're copying, if the work is more than 10 chapters and you're copying just one chapter, that's a small enough amount that you can say the person using it wouldn't have bought the whole book instead. So she sort of made that cutoff. As long as it's less than this, that's an amount that's okay. And in the case where the work was less than 10 chapters, she said that cutoff then is 10% of whatever the overall number of pages is. So that's what she did to try and simplify things a little bit. This is the thing that the appeals court took the greatest exception to. This is the one that they disliked the most. They said, you cannot make bright lines. Fair use is so contextual that there is no number at which you can say, as long as you're under this, factor 3 favors fair use. And certainly not that as long as you're under this, overall it's a fair use. And so what they said is, you need to consider that, obviously. So things like, is it a full chapter or not? How many chapters? How many pages? The percentage. But you need to consider that in the context of each individual work, because works are different lengths. There's different amount of importance assigned to different, some works, they have a single chapter that's particularly important that most people would go to that work to consult. The idea there is it's the heart of the work. So the appeals court said, when you're considering amount, not only do you have to consider number totals, but you need to consider, did they take more than they needed? Were they taking only what they needed to accomplish the educational objective that they were going for in the course? Did they copy a bigger section just because it was more convenient to sort of fill out the form with this bigger chunk than the bit that they actually needed? Did they copy the heart of the work? You have to consider all those things together, they said. So this is an example of the analysis that came down just, and I'm not expecting you to read all this, but this is the last paragraph of the analysis of factor 3 for one of the instances that she considered back in March when the decision came down. And you can see those three things there that they were highlighting. So you see 8% of the pages. So this was a case, in this particular instance, it was a 44 chapter book. And so the professor had asked the library to copy 4 chapters of it, which amounted to just over 100 pages, which was 8% of the overall work. And so she notes that and said, it fits the pedagogical aim. So what she was trying to do with those 4 chapters seems like an appropriate amount. And none of those chapters was the heart of the work. Nonetheless, 4 chapters and over 100 pages, she considered that quantity to be extremely large, and therefore factor 3 for her weighed strongly against fair use. And this is the sort of analysis she did for each one of those things. And there was another case where it was a book that was less than 10 chapters, and so they only copied 1 chapter of the book, but that 1 chapter made up 12% of the work. And again, she considered that excessive. She considered that exceptionally large. When you're over that amount, then you're really substituting for the sale of the book there. That much of the book, students should have to buy it. So that's mainly instructive for us, not because again, it's a bright line, but we get the idea there that even though the circuit court said you can't have a certain amount that underneath which for sure it's fair use, but that still seems to be where the scales start to tip for her, is when you're talking about a book, and this is different obviously than a journal article or a song or a video or some other kind of medium, but when you're talking about a book at least, where the scales start to tip in terms of substituting for the sale of the original is right around 1 chapter or 10%. But that can't be taken in isolation. You have to consider that in the context of the rest of the details of your scenario. So that was factor 3. And then factor 4 deals with market harm. And so market harm we've sort of touched on a little bit with factor 3. So one of the things they consider is the amount that you're taking substituting for the sale of the whole thing. The other thing that this case considers that no other case that I've seen considers is what happens when there's a licensing market. So, all right, you're using only 1 chapter of the book that you want to use, But what happens when you go to the publisher's website or the Copyright Clearance Center and they have this mechanism available where you can license however many pages you want on a certain amount of cents per student basis. So you're using a small amount, but the publishers are saying, hey, for even those small amounts, we have a way that you can, on a sort of per page per student basis, license that content so that we can still be making microtransaction profit off of that. What happens in that case? Then is the licensing market making it so you can't ever use fair use then, as long as they're putting that out there? Because it's pretty easy for publishers to just put that up on a website, even if nobody's ever interested in it, and say, yeah, we offer licensing for that. So anybody who could possibly use our work in any way should have to license it because we're making that available. So that was, the publishers, that was the argument they were trying to make, is even if you're not substituting for the sale of the original, you might be harming our licensing market by what you're doing here. So the court responded to that in the following way. They said, if digital permissions are available, so if you look up your work in something like the Copyright Clearance Center on the publisher's website, and you see that there is a way to license the work or a small portion of it for the purpose that you're using. So if you want to put it in e-reserves or in Moodle, or you want to pass out copies in class or put it in a course pack, oftentimes they'll have licenses for all of those things, and they'll give you a cost and say, this is how much it costs per student per page. If that's the case and you find that, the judge assumes then by default, you are harming the licensing market if you don't pay them their fees to do that, except when it can be demonstrated that there really is no demand for that. There is no licensing market demand for that particular work. So the way this looked in this Georgia State case is, she said, all right, we assume that there's market harm because there was a licensing mechanism available, but then they subpoenaed the sales data for all of those different books from the publishers, and they looked at, okay, for this title, you made $100,000 in book sales, and you made $75 in licensing over the life of this book. Just because you're asserting that there's a licensing market doesn't mean it's actually true. It appears from your sales data that nobody actually wants to license your book. So when that could be demonstrated that that was the case, then it tipped back in favor of Georgia State. The judge said, yeah, there's real harm happening here, but it's minuscule compared to what they're actually making. It's not undermining their incentive to publish the book in the first place. So even though there's a licensing market, it's small enough that in this case we can say they're not really substantially being harmed here. And so factor 4 then, as long as they weren't using too much, tipped back in favor of Georgia State in that case. And that, I think, is probably why the publishers appealed this again, is because they maybe didn't like that reasoning there. And it'll be interesting to see what the circuit court does with that logic. But for the time being, that's, what happens then is the question. If we're not going to know the sales data for those things, we can't subpoena those things. So how do we practically use this to make a fair use decision becomes the question in looking at this. And unfortunately, there is a certain amount of sort of risk and ambiguity in any fair use decision unless your fair use scenario specifically has been litigated all the way up to Supreme Court. You're not going to know for sure what the official law of the land is. And so it's kind of assessing the risk and making your best guess. So I was helping somebody with this particular scenario the other day. It was a book chapter that they wanted to scan and upload to a system similar to the one Georgia State was using. But the book that they were using, it was a book that was more of like a devotional book. So it was primarily marketed towards churches and small groups. So everybody in a small group maybe would get a copy of this book and I'll read through it together. And so the primary market for that book wasn't a textbook, it wasn't even a higher education market. It was more of a personal, spiritual sort of book. In that case, I don't know for sure because I can't see the sales data, but I can make a pretty fair guess that there probably isn't a very strong licensing market for that work. There's not a lot of professors who are clamoring to have that chapter scanned and uploaded for their course. So in that case, that was an example where if it were me, I would probably feel like, based on the data we have seen from the publishers of even academic books, something like that probably carries very low risk for harming the licensing market. So as long as my amount and other factors were in place so I wasn't substituting for the sale of the original, I would probably feel fairly confident that that was a strong fair use argument. So I'll summarize these points here, and then I know there's a couple of questions, and then I'll answer those as well as I'm able. So sort of in summary, if you get to fair use, so remember that we're thinking about, there's things to think about like public domain. Is there a license available? Is there another exception that covers it? Remember to think of those things first before we get to fair use. But when you're thinking about fair use in the current climate, some of the things that we can learn from this fair use case that helps us sort of understand a little bit better maybe how we can use fair use are if you can make a transformative use argument, that really strengthens your overall fair use case. So say you're using a workbook, not as a workbook, but as a pedagogical exercise that students can pick apart the workbook and see how it's constructed and critique it. That would be an example possibly of a transformative higher education use. If you can make that case, your fair use argument is very strong overall. But even if not, factor one can still lean in your favor because you're making educational uses in the course that you're teaching. Be sure to look at the specific nature of the content. So it's not just, is it fact or fiction? What sort of content makes up the excerpt that I'm looking to use here. Remember, there's no bright lines. You can't say automatically because I'm using less than X amount, it's fair use. But again, 10% or one chapter when you're talking about books is where the scales seem to tip for these core decisions that we do have. And then finally, don't forget about the licensing market when you're considering market harm. So not just is your use substituting for the sale of the original, but how might it affect the licensing market if one exists. So that's the end of what I have for you. If there are any questions, and I know that there are, I'll be happy to try to figure it out. Yeah?
In the last example you had about the devotional that was uploaded. Now, I would assume if the professor wanted that to be a devotion for the class, that would cause market harm.
Potentially, yeah. So
or if they were using it to analyze the content and the logic of this something, then it would be for educational use.
Yeah, well, and that kind of gets at purpose. That's a good question. So the question is, if you're using it as a devotional, that last example of the small group book, if you're using it as a devotional to introduce your class, how does that change the fair use scenario? And really that more relates to purpose, because in that case, the purpose is not necessarily educational there. That's sort of a, you're not using that. That could happen in any class. It's not a, how to construct a devotional because that's what this class is about. It's, sort of separate from the pedagogical aims of your course. And so that not only changes, the sort of the licensing market thing, but it really changes the purpose
That
of.
would be a good idea.
We'd have to look at the specific, it's very situational, again, work to work, so I'm not going to say whether or not I think that would be fair. I'd have to have a little more detail than that, but yeah, that's a good question as far as purpose is concerned. It does definitely change the purpose to be using it that way. Go ahead.
What about YouTube? Is there any supervision of YouTube of things posted on there at all? Or it's just anybody can post anything and they post copyrighted things?
That's a great question, and for time, I didn't squish that into the earlier part. You'll notice that I actually used a YouTube clip in my presentation here, and that obviously, when I was looking at that video, it wasn't Fox, the owner of The Simpsons, who put that up there. So with YouTube, YouTube has got its own terms of service. So when it comes to licensing, what's in there, there is a terms of service agreement that sort of outlines what you can and can't do with those videos. But YouTube is a little bit different than a lot of other things because stuff gets pirated so much in YouTube. They have a system called Content ID that they use. Big, media and record industry companies, they often have all of their content uploaded to YouTube's own database. And so YouTube is constantly scanning stuff that gets uploaded to identify things that are infringing that those big studios use. And so in the case of that Simpsons video, Fox is super litigious when it comes to taking down stuff like that. So I know for sure that they know that, or I can't imagine they don't know that that's in there. But there's a way using the Content ID system to monetize that. So Fox then has the option of either saying, take it down, we don't want it out there, or give us a cut of the revenue that you're making every time somebody watches this, or they link it, so that particular clip is linked back to a place where you can purchase from Fox the full episode that comes out of. So with YouTube, yeah, there's a lot of pirated stuff in there, but a lot of it has been monetized by the companies that use it. So you wouldn't want to be ripping or copying YouTube videos yourself to use offline. So this wasn't copied, this was just embedded, and I streamed it live, off the YouTube's own player. And so that is very different from my trying to download it and use it in a class offline or upload it to my own Moodle course. So when you're doing things like linking to YouTube, YouTube's pretty safe that way. You're not going to get in trouble for linking to something that's in YouTube because it's on the person who's actually posting it. They're the ones sort of liable for that infringement. So generally with stuff on the web like that, there's disagreement over whether dislinking or deep linking has any copyright implications, but generally speaking, unless you suspect that the stuff you're linking to is pirated, so you're not going to send your students to a torrent site to download something because that's probably pirated. But if you find things online that, as far as you can tell, look legit, you really can't get in trouble for linking to it. But that's a very different thing from like downloading it and hosting it and distributing it yourself. Does that answer your question?
All right, another question. What about intellectual property? Let's say you're a professor, a qualified professor, you design and build a course and teach it for a number of years, and then in a cost-saving move, the institution fires you, hires someone for less money and uses your course, your lecture notes, your exams. Is there any recourse?
So the question there was, what happens if you design a course and the institution wants to use it and sort of cut you out of the picture? Is it your intellectual property? Can you stop them? That really comes down to the contract that you signed with the university and how much you retain of your intellectual property rights for the stuff that you create in the course of your employment. So there is no real sort of copyright general law that would cover that. Well, there is, but it's almost always trumped by a contract that you sign with the institution. So that would be something in terms of looking at Bethel's faculty handbook and copyright policy, that's what would govern those things over how much of that course you control and what the institution can do with it. So that's the simple answer to that question. The more complicated practical one would involve actually looking at those terms. I don't have that in front of me, so I don't really know off the top of my head. Journal articles. You mean as opposed to book chapters?
Right.
Putting them on e-reserve? The Georgia State case, that's an astute observation. So the Georgia State case doesn't deal specifically with journal articles. It deals only with book chapters. And there is reason to think, as I have thought about that, there's reason to think that they would treat individual journal articles as self-contained units. So it really comes down again to market harm. So if you can go to the journal's website and they have an ability to, or they have a mechanism where you can buy an individual article without having to subscribe. You can just buy individual articles for $30 or whatever it is that they charge. Then what you have to consider is how your use would be affecting the market for that. So it's not just, are you substituting for a journal subscription? It's, are you substituting for the sale of those individual articles? And that, again, there's no sort of blanket answer to the question of what about journal articles. It really is sort of specific to the publication and how they make it available and how it's normally purchased. So we'd have to look at a particular journal article. Yes?
How does ILL play a factor with affecting the market of, like, for example, with journal articles? I mean, arguably, all of the students could go request that article via ILL. How does that play a factor?
Yeah, so the question is, how does interlibrary loan, how does that work then if, everybody, that could conceivably be harming the market, and what if every student did that? Interlibrary loan is typically accomplished through a specific exception in the copyright law just for libraries, and that's section 108 of the copyright law. And so there's very specific criteria outlined for if you want to use interlibrary loan Typically, you have to do it just for private study. It can't be something that you're further distributing. It has to come from sort of a legally obtained source. There's requirements for the library, how open they have to be to the public in order to qualify for that exception. So interlibrary loan is a little bit different from fair use because it's one of those specific exceptions that, it's been around for 40 years now, so libraries have a pretty good sense of how to interpret that Section 108 section, but it is just a little bit different. And to answer your question of what if every student used ILL to get the same article, the court, there's been cases not in higher education but in the corporate world similar to that. There's a real famous one involving Texaco where scientists were copying journal articles, a bunch of them from the same subscription. And so the short answer is when your copying becomes sort of systematic like that, so instead of buying the article for your course, if you're directing all your students to go interlibrary loan it, you are causing market harm there. You're getting something without paying the customary cost. It's not sort of a student was doing this particular project and needed an article we didn't have for their personal research. It was, I'm using this in my curriculum, but I'm not going to pay for it. The way I'm getting around licensing it is to send students, to do that. So there are, that specific exception sort of spells out those different things, and it is different. I'm already over time, so if you have additional questions, I'd be happy to talk to you individually about them, but thank you for coming.